Members of the Green Party, thank you, and thank you, Rolf. I'm delighted to be here with my wife, Sarah Stace, in Berlin. She's one of the great leaders of the women's movement in our country. And I'm also delighted to be here just 3 weeks after the first anniversary of the founding of the chapter in Washington, D.C. of the German Green Party. And I'm especially happy to be here just a little more than 3 months after the inauguration of President Barack Obama, who has ended some of America's darkest days and replaced it with what I hope will be one of the finest chapters between the relations of the United States and Europe. So first, a quick word of explanation about the Blue-Green Alliance. We are a partnership in the United States of 4 major unions: the United Steelworkers, the Laborers, the Communication Workers, and the Service Employees International Union, and 2 national environmental organizations, the Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council. With over 6.5 million members, we touch virtually every community in our country. We've become one of America's leading advocates for global warming solutions, and we believe that the benefits and economic opportunities of doing that will far outweigh the costs. We've popularized the terms green economy and green jobs, and we believe that it should be our goal to turn every job in America into a green job and to turn every green job into a union job. We also believe that the rights of workers to join a union and engage in real collective bargaining are fundamental to an economy that is fair, and that there is a direct correlation in society between a high degree of unionization and strong environmental standards. We reject this old stereotype that you have to balance a trade-off between jobs and the environment. It's not good jobs or a clean environment. In today's world, it's both or neither. I think we'll look back on 2008 as a year in which an extraordinary series of economic events marked the unraveling of one economic model and the launching of the new. 2008 was the year that saw oil prices reach $145 a barrel and then drop to $38 less than 6 months later. 2008 also brought an end to the so-called Green Revolution, the agricultural revolution that was founded on oil-based fertilizers that since the 1980s promised to end world hunger through modern methods of farming. It was a year of skyrocketing food shortages, in which food prices suddenly tracked the oil prices on which agriculture has become dependent. It was a year in which food riots suddenly swept across parts of Asia and Africa. 2008 was a year in which scientists noted that a majority of the world's fisheries were now in collapse and could no longer provide the primary source of protein to over 1 billion inhabitants. And 2008 was the year in which water shortages were suddenly described as endemic and expected to produce 300 million water-stressed people in Africa in 10 years and over 1 billion in Asia in the next 30. Desertification is also on the rise, with an area the size of our state of Nebraska turning into desert every year, while simultaneously we destroy forests 10 times the size of our state of Connecticut. And to cap off the accomplishments of 2008, we discovered that our entire financial system was gorged with debt and supposedly blue-chip investment banks leveraged at ratios of 30-1. Future generations will look back and ask, how did we ever think such an economic order was sustainable? Or as Vice President Gore said recently about the United States, quote, we're borrowing billions from China to buy oil from the Middle East, to burn in ways that are destroying the planet. Every bit of that has got to change. But what does it mean to change every bit of this? Take, for instance, the United States' relationship with China. A year ago, the U.S. had a $400 billion trade deficit with China, and as a result, China holds over $1.6 trillion in U.S. currency reserves. In other words, lending U.S. consumers billions of dollars so that we can continue to buy products we no longer make for ourselves. China today is workshop of the world with over 40% of its economy devoted for manufacturing. In less than 10 years, it expanded its steel industry from 100 million tons a year, the size of the U.S. steel industry, to 400 million tons, nearly half the world capacity. And it managed in that same 10 years to overcome the United States as the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Typical of the millions of manufacturing jobs that left the U.S. to relocate to China were the jobs of a small company called Etch-a-Sketch in Bryan, Ohio, who made a famous United States childhood toy. The cost of labor got too high, the parent company said, even though they were only paying $10 or $12 an hour. But they did provide company-paid health insurance and a pension. But according to that company, they had to keep the cost of their toy below $10 so that they could be competitive in Walmart with other Chinese manufactured toys. So they closed the plant. The New York Times did a series in 2005 about what happened to the workers who made the Etch-a-Sketch toy in China. And here's what they found. By moving to China, that company saved over 20% on their production costs. But with lower productivity and higher transportation costs, the only way that they could realize these savings was by breaking Chinese labor law and by paying less than the Chinese minimum wage. And they refused to pay legal overtime on 84-hour weeks. And they refused to pay legally required health insurance. And they refused to pay legally required retirement programs. Only by breaking Chinese labor law could they make this proposition work. So the current incentives in the global economy reward, they demand a race to the bottom, destroying modest but decent jobs in Bryan, Ohio, and replacing them with jobs that undercut even the minimum standards set by the Chinese government. So to change every bit of this means that the economic and environmental incentives to create and distribute wealth in the world economy have got to be fundamentally altered. Underlying the economic collapse in the United States is the simple fact that we can no longer rely on fossil fuels to grow our economy. The more we try, the more we aggravate the destructive factors that made 2008 such a pivotal year. Does anyone really want to go back to an economy based on $145 a barrel oil? I don't think so. And that's why the global warming debate is of such importance to the labor movement around the world. Certainly the environmental goals are important, but to a movement like ours, whose fundamental mission is about economic justice, the debate about global warming is really a debate about what the economy of the next century will look like. Who will profit? Who will lose? What kind of cars does the world need and where will they be manufactured? What raw materials will we use and for what purpose? Will we invest in freight rail or in interstate highways? Who will write the rules? Will it be Wall Street or will it be Main Street? Will health care in this new economy be a global commodity or a human right? Right now, the initial phase of this debate in the United States is taking place over the allocation of resources in the stimulus package that attempt to bring the recession to an end. And there are two colliding views. One view is represented by those who long to return to the indulgences of the last 2 decades, an era not unlike the 1920s, marked by reckless excess. The champions of Wall Street have focused primarily on saving the financial industry as we know it by flooding it with cheap credit in hopes that we can create another wave of American consumption fed by another generation of unsustainable trade deficits with trillions of more dollars. But this economic model has run its full course. There isn't an ounce of evidence that such a strategy will create a single job in the United States outside of on Wall Street. The other view is that only investments in a clean energy infrastructure can right what's wrong in the American and global economy and provide jobs in the short term and steady growth in the long term. Unlike other stimulus actions, these investments will, over time, pay for themselves in efficiency improvements and energy price stability. And they will put us on the pathway of stopping the ridiculous practice of rewarding work where it's done with the cheapest labor and most expensive environmental impacts. Take for example, another recent New York Times story about how carrots are grown in Great Britain, then picked and flown to Kenya in the morning, where they are washed and packaged in plastic bags and then flown back to London supermarket shelves that same afternoon, all to take advantage of cheap labor. Now, the recent American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was a big step in the right direction under President Obama. It devoted over $100 billion to green initiatives, committing us to triple our supplies of renewable energy, expanding high-speed rail, building renewable energy equipment, expanding weatherization programs tenfold, investing in broadband, the smart grid for electrical transmission, and a host of other new technologies. All these were good. But they were only a down payment on the green economy, and like all down payments, this one will be squandered if we don't move rapidly to keep paying the next installments, including passing cap and trade legislation in the United States before the end of 2009. These are the programs that can actually create jobs when implemented correctly and put the American economy and the world economy back to work. Now, all these efforts, I think, set the stage for the United Nations Copenhagen talks. And there are differing views on how to reach an agreement. There are some who would prefer that the climate talks remain strictly an environmental affair and purposefully limit the possibility that climate solutions might change the way our global economy works. Free market principles, in their view, must not be compromised in order to reach agreement. Development principles, which have long disadvantaged poor nations, must not be altered. The other view, which is supported by the Blue-Green Alliance and is increasingly being heard around the world, has called for a global Green New Deal that links our solutions to climate change with our strategy to stop the recession. Last month, I was invited to Nairobi, Kenya, to speak to the United Nations Environment Programme's Biennial Ministerial and address the world's environment ministers on why the Blue-Green Alliance was advocating this global Green New Deal. I told them that I thought the New Deal in our country in the Depression was founded on 3 principles, and that a Green New Deal for the global economy should embrace these 3 new principles as well. In the 1930s, the New Deal first meant an active role by government in correcting and shaping the inherent imperfection of markets. When banks couldn't function in the 1930s, they were regulated. When wages fell or stagnated, a minimum wage law was passed to stabilize workers' buying power. Second, our Great Depression New Deal meant an active role by government in investing in job creation that directly tied social goals like rural electrification, infrastructure improvement, national parks, and so forth. And third, it meant the creation of worker protections that gave workers in the United States their first opportunity to use their collective strength to share fairly in the wealth they helped to create. So a Green New Deal for the global economy must embrace 3 similar principles. First, it must correct the imperfection in global markets by putting a price on carbon pollution instead of passing it off to the next generation or the poorest among us. Second, we must invest in massive job creation around the world in the clean energy economy. It's not enough that our investments reduce carbon. They also must create tens of millions of social purpose jobs. We need jobs harnessing the geothermal energy of the Rift Valley in Kenya, not washing carrots. We need jobs building the solar energy grid in Bangladesh that electrify that country, not jobs that undercut even China's labor laws. And of course, we need jobs in the developed world that put our enormous industrial capacity back to work making the gearboxes for wind turbines, the cable for new transmission lines, the rail for high-speed trains, and on and on. And third, we need to conduct world trade in a way that rewards workers for exercising their right to join a union, because that's the tried and true way of creating wealth and equity simultaneously in global society. Now, many observers believe that the road to a successful treaty in Copenhagen begins with successful legislation in Washington, D.C. And those who oppose the restructuring of the global economy understand that as well. Thus, the first step for success in Copenhagen was the election of a President of the United States who believes in science and in basing his climate and economic policies on science. And I'm proud to be with you today in having played a small role in ending some of our worst years in America and replacing them with what I hope will be some of the best. But the second step The second step does mean passing a climate bill in the U.S. Congress or making substantial progress toward doing that, such as passing it in both houses before we assemble in Denmark. And much hangs on our ability to pass the right climate legislation. In our climate change principles, the 6 partners of the Blue-Green Alliance, 4 unions, 2 environmental organizations, tried to summarize just how important it was to create the right architecture for climate change legislation. First, we need to be true to the best advice that the world's scientific consensus is providing us. We say that our solutions must put us on a path to make substantial near-term reductions and to reduce our own emissions by 80% by 2050. And second, and equally important, we must pass climate legislation that creates the millions of jobs that will put Americans and people of other countries all around the world back to work, and that means including enhanced labor protections. And finally, it means provisions that provide economic opportunity and fairness to all those who have been shunted aside in our current economy. In a word, Labor's goal in 2009 in both the United States and in Copenhagen should be climate change legislation and a climate change treaty that creates the Green New Deal for the global economy. If we aspire to less, or if we opt to fight for jobs at the expense of the environment, or if we choose to sacrifice jobs to achieve our environmental goals, we may feel in our isolation that we made the right pragmatic choice. But in reality, we will have chosen to do nothing, for we will have gotten neither. Let's choose both. Let's choose together for a Green New Deal for the global economy. Thank you very much, members of the Green Party.